Waiting, waiting, waiting. Where the hell have you been? Over there. Where's your Bren? And why do you have a hammer? It's over there on the tripod. Isn't it obvious? And the hammer? Well, something about a fixed line, so I was looking to fix it. And well, you know, I need a tool. I don't quite understand, though. I mean, you know, what's wrong with it in the first place? And well, it's hard to find, really. I mean, there's a telephone line over there. I don't know if that's what we're talking about. What line? I don't know. You're the one that told me to. I'm finding it very difficult right now because what line are we talking about? I have a tool, but like I said, the telephone line? Is it the sewer line? No, I don't know. Idiot. Oh, I said lay the gun on a fixed line. You know, pointed at the target. Oh. Well, what am I supposed to use to lay the gun then? Use the sight. Yeah. Oh, my God, we're going to die. I think that'll work. Although much thought had been put to the way modern warfare was to play out during the 1930s, ideas, concepts, and tactics were far from mature and perfect. On the very cusp of war, development of the Bren and its tactics was still very much an ongoing process. One of the foreseen tasks that the Bren was to perform was that of the engagement of a target or target area on a fixed line. Initially, this could be achieved with the use of the tripod and its mechanical features. As peacetime ebbed and the lights went out over Europe once again, an enhancement was made to this capability, introduced at the 11th hour. Perhaps seen as a more technical solution to maintaining a specific lay with the Bren in defensive or deliberate situations, it was destined to be consigned to the dustbin of history, as this capability was of marginal importance at best, and the added expense and material needed to produce an overly complex accessory for it was wasted effort. It would later become one of the rarest of Bren accessories. This was the fixed line sight, Mark I. The way the Bren and its use evolved over the course of the war stands in parallel to a large degree with the usual maturation of all things technical, whether mechanical or theoretical, throughout the course of the war. If we look at the intent or doctrine of the Army in 1939 and compare it with the armies in 1945, we would see many ideas or weapons, thought to be important at the beginning, found to be wanting or redundant, and evolve in either design or use to fit in with the new paradigm. For instance, and directly related to this video, the Bren's role in the defense was seen to be such that it would take on some of the battlefield tasks normally attributed to the Vickers. Covering specific points or areas as part of a deliberate defense, such as a gap in an obstacle, along a defile, or across the front of a neighboring friendly unit, was known as firing on a fixed line. Now this topic has been covered in the Bren preliminary training video Part 2, but here we'll expand on the details and importantly present the device that was introduced in 1940 to, it was thought, enhance the effectiveness of the Bren in this role. The fixed line sight, Mark I. The fixed line sight seems to have been developed and manufactured starting in 1939, with its issue and the publication of associated training material occurring in early 1940. Truly the 11th hour. It first appears in a manual, Weapons Training Memorandum No. 1 of March 1940. This was a collection of amendments made to the various existing manuals of the Small Arms series, published from 1937 to 1939. The first of these covered a number of subjects which are presented in amendment form to be applied to the relevant manual. We've used this very document before on the channel, as it contains specific references to shooting from the hip. A video on this subject exists on the channel, featuring Mike from Bloke on the Range that was filmed some years ago. In Article 5 and the associated appendix, the fixed line sight is introduced for inclusion into the Bren gun pamphlet number 4 in the small arm series. The sight has 3 main components: the lensatic sight, the bottom plate, and the bracket. There are a number of parts that bear mention, and they are listed here. Note the position of the quick release and the fine adjustment screw. The bracket was tapered to fit into the dovetail found on the Mark I Bren, the only type of Bren then in service. The bottom plate was fixed to the bracket and rotated upon it, controlled by the quick release and the fine adjustment screw. You'll note the engagement of the zero latch, the purpose of which is unclear on the fixed line sight because it does not zero at that position. This was found on the Vickers dial sight and was probably manufactured this way simply due to a common pattern. The upper part of the bottom plate controlled the elevation by means of the elevation screw and clamp, which worked the elevation slide and its ramp. Mounted on the bottom plate was the lensatic sight. This was an occluded type sight that featured a frosted white triangle as its aiming point or reticle. Rather than looking through it like a telescopic sight, it was used with both eyes open, thereby positioning the white triangle on the aiming point as seen by the other eye. The sight was carried in a normal 37 pattern binocular case, though this was fitted with a special wooden liner that held the zeroed sights securely. Strangely, it could not accommodate an adjusted sight, something that will become apparent in its importance as we continue. On the right side of the bottom plate, there is what was known as the lensatic sight leveling lever and stop. It is adjustable in a semi-permanent way and can be engaged and disengaged by moving the rotating pin. At the time of publication, its exact purpose on the fixed line sight is unclear, but it was a feature of the Vickers dial sight, with which the fixed line sight had many common parts. For use in certain circumstances, the Mark III aiming post and lamp could be used. While not required for proper functioning of the fixed line sight, it was a convenient expedient when a distant aiming point, normally an environmental feature such as a telephone pole or tree or immovable object, was not optimum. Of course, the post could be used in the day, but at night the lamp could be fitted, ensuring that the aiming point was visible. The post could be deployed 2 ways. In the lower position, the upper arm with the white disc was clamped at right angles, and the post was laid on the ground. The upper position saw the upper arm clamped at 180 degrees, in a straight line, and then the 3-pronged base driven into the ground. Both the post and the lamp were standard issue with the Vickers, and not particular to the Bren. Perhaps a bit more detail regarding fixed line engagements. Like it says on the tin, these were a way for a machine gun to engage a specific target from a mount as part of an integrated defense. One target from one position. This had the advantage of being precise, more so than with the Bren used in the light roll. The target selected here is an approach to a friendly position, with the Bren on its tripod positioned to a flank. Part of the safety considerations was that the line of fire had to be at least 5 degrees away from friendly troops. This method of engagement works not by individual aim at individual targets, but rather one that uses the fall of the rounds to create quite literally a beaten zone, through which the enemy would have to advance at their peril. This required knowledge of Bren fire and trajectories, so that the beaten zone and dangerous space, as outlined in part 1 of the preliminary training video, could be placed in the most advantageous position. With a rapid rate of fire delivered by a 2-man Bren crew, this belt of fire, unwavering and consistent, would pose a most significant obstacle, and could be fired at any time, day or night. Laying the Bren on a fixed line started by first bringing the gun into action on its tripod. In a defensive situation such as this, the spare barrel and extra ammunition would be present and handled by the number 2. Once the tripod was positioned, the number 1 could then bring the gun forward and mount it. As mentioned, the tripod was not a piece of equipment that was carried around all the time, but rather it was carried in the platoon truck and brought forward in certain defensive circumstances. Next, a target would be indicated, here a specific bend in a road. Number 1 Bren, 800. Slightly right. Bend in road. Lay. To lay the Bren, first the sights were set to the appropriate range. Then they were aligned on the target by use of the traversing bar and elevating wheel and clamp. Once the Bren was laid, the target could be engaged as required. We can see here in this period training film that the rate of fire, including magazine changes, could be quite significant when a proper two-man crew was employed. In order to record the target for future use, in the event that the Bren needed to be moved or used elsewhere, the fixed-line sight and aiming post would be brought into action. What the sight afforded, given the indicated target, and the line of sight to the target, was the use of a remote aiming point, in this case the Mark III aiming post, onto which the lensatic sight was traversed. This established a specific angle between target and post. The same principle applied to the elevation of the sight. Naturally, the aiming post would not necessarily be at the same elevation as the target, so the lensatic sight was elevated or depressed so that it was aimed at the aiming post. This combination of direction and elevation was preserved by the sight's settings. In reality, it looked like this. With the gun laid on the target, the sight was taken from the pouch and roughly unzeroed. This brought the lensatic sight to a position that paralleled the barrel, rather than being perpendicular as it was stored in the pouch. The sight was then slid onto the dovetail, and the fixing screw tightened. Next, the number 2 was sent forward with the aiming post.
Post 2.
Unfolding it to the appropriate position, he ran out about 10 yards and placed the post within 30 degrees of the line of sight, most conveniently off to the left. The manual actually stated that the post was placed by the number 1, but the way we have demonstrated here made more sense as the number 2 had already brought up the ammunition. The reason for this specific positioning was the fact that the magazine impeded the use of the lensatic sight if it was traversed too much. Keeping it within 30 degrees of the barrel ensured this did not happen. The sight was traversed by first unlocking the quick release, then rotating the bottom plate so that the lensatic sight was pointed generally at the aiming post. We can see in this view the action of the quick release in disengaging the adjusting screw, allowing for free rotation of the bottom plate. Here we see the action of the elevation slide and ramp, raising or lowering the point of aim with the lensatic sight. In this view from above, it becomes apparent that the adjustment of the sight beyond 30 degrees could make it difficult or even impossible to use the lensatic sight, the view of it being blocked by the magazine. With the fine adjustment and elevating screws, the lensatic sight was positioned so that the frosted triangle in the occluded sight picture had its apex in the center of the white disc. Thus, the Bren was pointed directly at the target, and the lensatic sight pointed directly at the aiming post. As mentioned, the whole purpose of the fixed-line sight was to enable the same target to be engaged in low-visibility circumstances, whether at night or if the target was obscured by smoke, in addition to relay the gun after the Bren had been dismounted and used elsewhere. This latter example is demonstrated here. First, the sight was removed from the dovetail. The salient aspect to this was it was critical that it was not disturbed from its setting, a bit of a problem when the pouch only accepted it when it was zeroed. While the number 2 gathered the ammunition in spare barrel, the number 1 could dismount the gun from the tripod. Moving to a new location, the Bren could be brought into action in the light roll to face new threats approaching from different directions. Once the new target had been engaged and its task complete, the Bren could be returned to the fixed-line target promptly and with great accuracy, as long as the tripod, aiming post, and sight settings had not been disturbed. On arrival back at the tripod's position, the Bren was remounted in the usual way. Once secured, the sight was retrieved from wherever it was carried. although the pouch is used here, admittedly, without the liner. Note here that the sight is still set, in the same position as when it was removed from the gun. The sight was placed back in the dovetail and secured with the fixing screw. We can see here the offset angle of the lensatic sight, corresponding to the aforementioned angle between the barrel and the aiming post. Assuming that the elevating mechanism and its position on the traversing bar was not exactly where it had been when the Bren was dismounted, the gun was relayed, both in bearing and elevation, using the traversing bar and elevating wheel, though critically not with the use of the sights on the target, as had been originally the case, but rather with the sight onto the aiming post. Because the sight settings had not been disturbed, nor the tripod and aiming post, by moving the Bren so that the fixed line sight pointed back at the post, the original lay of the gun, and consequently the direction and elevation of its barrel in relation to the target, was completely restored. This is confirmed by the fact that with the sights correctly set to the original range to the target, they point precisely back towards it. Though difficult to see, this is the bend in road initially indicated as the target for the fixed line engagement. Once this process was complete, immediate and accurate fire could be delivered regardless of whether the actual target could be physically seen or not. Perhaps this composite shot demonstrates accurately the concept of the fixed line shoot. The bend in road could be seen as a natural choke point for real vehicles or unsuspecting infantry, especially if obstacles such as wire or minefields were employed. As you can imagine, watching the tracer arc towards the target, attempting to get through this gap around the bend in the road while under such accurate and relatively sustained fire would have been highly taxing or near impossible. Certainly, if the enemy had been caught in such a gap, extracting themselves from that position would have been very difficult and costly. As daylight faded, the target could still be engaged with the same effect. The tripod holding the Bren steady and laid with the fixed line sight, the rounds went where they were supposed to go. Perhaps the biggest misconception regarding the fixed line sight is that it is in some way related to indirect firing. This is patently false. The fixed line sight does not possess the features required to enable this capability. Firstly, it does not feature any kind of scale or graduations in degrees that would be necessary so that the Bren could be laid and corrections or switches be made. In addition, it does not have a leveling bubble, which is necessary to measure the elevation of the Bren for specific ranges. The lack of these two critical features alone betrays the fact that it is not intended for indirect fire. There was a sight designed for indirect fire with machine guns, however, the Vickers dial sight. Actually introduced around the same time as the fixed line sight, the dial sight was used throughout the war to replace the more rudimentary and embryonic equipment used during the Great War for the same indirect purpose. The sight did feature the necessary graduations, scales, and bubbles for indirect work, and was used perhaps most prolifically during the gargantuan pepperpot barrages of 1945. There, the Vickers guns of the divisional machine gun battalions fired en masse at great range to interdict key points behind German frontline positions. As you can see from these clips, indirect work required huge amounts of ammunition, water to cool the guns, not to mention a huge number of machine guns to achieve the effect. It is obvious that the Bren guns simply were not designed nor suitable for this type of engagement. For those wishing to learn more about indirect machine gun fire, may I suggest the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association website. There you can find a primer on indirect fire with the Vickers and a huge amount of information about the procedures, kit, and equipment used to achieve this capability. Brought into service just weeks before the invasion of France, the fixed line sight remains a bit of an enigma. As demonstrated, though quite effective at the role intended for it, it was that role which proved redundant, and thus the sight was doomed to the same fate. Fixed-line shooting never materialized in the way it might have been envisaged. When the Germans crossed the Meuse in May of 1940, They exercised a type of warfare that perhaps stood juxtaposed to that for which fixed-line shooting was foreseen. Clearly, the Bren used in the light role was much more useful, and indeed fixed, formalized defenses, constructed as they were in 1940, simply weren't the way forward. Perhaps the greatest shortcoming of the fixed-line sight was that it remained somewhat of a one-trick pony. Only one target could be recorded mechanically, and no subsequent adjustment was afforded by it. It is perhaps due to this one reason that it never developed into a truly useful piece of kit. Beyond the tactical paradigm, the fact that the tripod could just as easily, through the use of its various clamps and stops, perform the same fixed-line function without the need for an expensive and over-engineered sight, put the nail in the proverbial coffin. As it was after the evacuation of the army from Dunkirk in 1940 and the loss of so much of its equipment and weapons, newer Bren production, now frantic in its importance, switched to the Mark I modified pattern. Simplifying production, it lost the dovetail on the body as an unnecessary feature. The era of the fixed-line sight was over before it began. There were very few references to the sight in use, and none known to me of its use in action. I did manage to come across a vaguely applicable anecdote on the web which claimed that an example, missing its lensatic sight, was discovered in Belgium amongst other so-called 1940 relics. Is this proof of its use, or at least presence in the field during the 1940 campaign? You be the judge. As with other videos in this series, I am indebted to many who have helped craft them. Friends of the channel Jarrett for performing the role of number 2 in 30-degree heat and battle dress, and to Bill, who graciously lent the use of his Mark I Bren, tripod, and ancillary equipment. Thanks to you both. And of course, thanks need to be extended to Rich at the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association for, as ever, providing the reference used in this video. It can be found on the association's website. Although hugely supportive of the channel's efforts in the Bren series thus far, this video in particular would absolutely not have happened without the use of the fixed-line sight. This was very kindly lent to the channel by the Museum and Archive of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. It's not every day that such an item becomes available for examination and use, and I was lucky to be the beneficiary of such an unexpected gesture. Thank you to James and Mike for acquiring the site in the first place and then lending it to the channel, and to Paul for the accompanying photographs. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. This video would not have been made had it not been for Sea and Arsenal and their incredible close-knit community of friends. My undying thanks and appreciation go to all those who, by hook or by crook, or by the kindness of their hearts, decided to contribute as they could to make my visit such a success. Your hospitality, energy, generosity, and expertise are beyond reproach. Matthias, May, Susie, David, Kristen, Sven, Hill, Jeff, Thomas, Henry, Aidan, and Bruno. You all spent untold hours of wrangling and sourcing the 14.5 million things that were needed to bring this project to fruition. I am truly humbled. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place. Because once we plug you up from the front, the back